Robert Hawthorne bought the dog because silence had become unbearable. The animal seller's pity-soaked voice echoed across the dusty Nevada marketplace. "Blind since birth, mister. Nobody wants him." Robert's calloused hands counted out coins while his 11-year-old son David watched with curious eyes. The dog's milky gaze seemed to pierce through dimensions Robert couldn't name. 3 months later, when the blizzard swallowed his boy whole and the world turned white with terror, Robert would understand that some purchases are made not by men, but by Providence itself, using broken hearts as currency. The dog arrived on a Tuesday that tasted of dust and regret. Robert carried the animal from the wagon to the porch of their ranch house, feeling the creature's ribs through matted fur, counting each bone like rosary beads of neglect. The seller had wrapped a frayed rope around the dog's neck, not a collar, just rope, as if the animal were cargo rather than life. David pressed his face against the kitchen window, breath fogging the glass as he watched his father set the dog down on weathered planks that had witnessed too many seasons of solitude. The dog stood motionless for several heartbeats, head tilted toward sounds only he could interpret. His ears twitched at the whisper of wind through the cottonwoods, at the distant lowing of cattle, at the creak of the windmill that had pumped water for 3 generations of Hawthorne men. Robert studied the animal's clouded eyes, seeing in them a reflection of his own blindness, the way he'd stumbled through the years since Martha's death, feeling his way through darkness that had nothing to do with sight. "What's his name, Pa?" David's voice carried through the screen door, thin and hopeful. The boy had been asking for a dog since his mother's funeral 2 years prior, but Robert had always found reasons to refuse. Too much work, too much expense, too much risk of loving something that could be lost. Now, watching the blind animal navigate the porch with careful, deliberate steps, Robert realized he'd bought the dog not out of kindness, but out of recognition, one broken thing calling to another. "Doesn't have one," Robert replied, his voice rough as sandpaper. "The seller said nobody bothered to name him." The dog's tail gave a tentative wag, as if responding to the sound of human voices discussing his existence. Robert knelt beside the animal, extending his hand palm up, letting the dog catch his scent. The wet nose touched his fingers with surprising gentleness, and Robert felt something shift in his chest, a door he'd kept locked creaking open just enough to let in a sliver of light. David burst through the screen door, his bare feet slapping against the porch boards. "Can I pet him? Will he bite?" The boy's excitement was infectious, filling the space between them with an energy Robert had almost forgotten existed. The dog turned toward David's voice, tail wagging with more confidence now, as if the child's joy was a language he understood perfectly. Robert watched his son kneel beside the animal, small hands stroking the matted fur with the reverence reserved for precious things. "He's beautiful, Pa," David whispered, and Robert saw the dog through his son's eyes, not as a burden or a charity case, but as a creature deserving of love despite his limitations. The afternoon sun slanted across the porch, casting long shadows that seemed to embrace all 3 of them, and for the first time in months, Robert felt the weight of silence lift just enough to let him breathe. The dog learned the ranch's rhythms faster than Robert had expected. Within a week, the animal could navigate from the porch to the barn without stumbling, his nose mapping a world that eyes couldn't show him. Robert watched from the kitchen window as David led the dog around the property, the boy's patient voice describing everything they passed. The chicken coop with its rusty hinges, the old oak tree where Martha used to hang laundry, the fence posts that marked the boundary between their land and the endless Nevada desert. "This is where the horses drink," David would say, guiding the dog's nose toward the water trough. "And here's where Pa keeps the feed." The dog absorbed each lesson with the intensity of a scholar, his ears constantly moving, cataloging sounds and scents that would become his compass. Robert found himself envying the animal's ability to navigate darkness with such grace, to find purpose in a world that had initially rejected him. The first storm came in early November, a gentle rehearsal for the brutal winter that would follow. Robert stood in the barn doorway, watching snow dust the ground like flour sifted through celestial fingers. The dog sat beside him, perfectly still, his head raised toward the sky as if reading messages written in the wind. "He knows," Robert murmured to himself, recognizing something ancient in the animal's posture, the way wild creatures sense changes that civilized men miss. David named the dog Scout during the second week, declaring that any animal who could find his way around the ranch so quickly deserved a name that honored his abilities. Robert had smiled at his son's logic, but the name felt right in ways he couldn't explain. Scout seemed to approve, his tail wagging whenever David called him, as if the boy had given him not just a name, but an identity worth claiming. The dog's presence changed the rhythm of their evenings. Instead of sitting in separate rooms, nursing their individual griefs, Robert and David found themselves on the porch after supper, watching Scout explore the yard with methodical precision. The animal had developed a routine, checking the perimeter of the house, pausing at certain spots where scents lingered, always returning to sit between father and son, as if his job was to bridge the gap that loss had carved between them. "Ma would have liked him," David said one evening, his voice barely audible above the wind. Robert felt his throat tighten, but for once the mention of Martha didn't feel like a blade between his ribs. Scout's warm weight against his leg seemed to absorb some of the pain, transforming it into something bearable. The dog had become their translator, helping them speak the language of healing they'd forgotten how to use. The blizzard arrived like a white fury, swallowing the horizon in minutes. Robert stood at the kitchen window, watching the world disappear behind walls of snow that moved like living ghosts across his land. The wind howled with a voice he'd never heard before, rattling the windows until the glass seemed to breathe with fear. Scout lay by the fireplace, his blind eyes turned toward the door as if he could see something beyond the storm that Robert couldn't. The dog's ears twitched with each gust, reading messages in the wind that spoke of danger approaching like a predator in the night. David had been playing in the barn when the first flakes began to fall, innocent and light as feathers. Now the boy was trapped somewhere in that white maze, and Robert's heart hammered against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. He'd called David's name until his throat burned raw, but the storm swallowed every sound, leaving only the terrible silence of unanswered prayers. The ranch that had been his sanctuary now felt like a prison, its familiar boundaries erased by nature's merciless hand. Each minute that passed carved deeper lines of panic across his weathered face, and he found himself bargaining with a god he'd stopped believing in years ago. Scout rose suddenly, his body rigid with purpose that seemed to flow from some ancient instinct. The dog moved to the door with deliberate steps, his nose pressed against the wood as if he could smell hope itself beyond the barrier. Robert watched in amazement as the animal began to whine, a sound so full of urgency that it cut through his despair like a blade through silk. The dog's tail wagged once, twice, then stilled as he turned his sightless gaze toward Robert with an expression that seemed to say, "Trust me." In that moment, Robert understood that Scout wasn't just a blind dog seeking shelter. He was a guide who had been waiting his entire life for this moment. The decision came without thought, born from a father's desperation and a growing faith in the impossible. Robert grabbed his heaviest coat and opened the door, feeling the storm's icy fingers reach for his soul with hungry claws. Scout stepped into the blizzard without hesitation, his black form immediately swallowed by the white chaos that surrounded them like a living thing. The dog moved with confidence that defied his blindness, following a path that existed only in his heightened senses, reading the landscape through smell and sound, and some deeper knowing that humans had forgotten. Robert stumbled behind him, his boots sinking into snow that seemed determined to claim him for the earth. The wind cut through his clothes like frozen knives, and the cold burned his lungs with each desperate breath. Scout moved ahead with steady purpose, occasionally pausing to ensure Robert followed, his form appearing and disappearing in the swirling white like a spirit guide leading a lost soul home. The dog's ears remained alert, constantly adjusting their direction as he navigated by sounds Robert couldn't hear. The subtle shift of wind around buildings, the different texture of snow over familiar ground, the whispered secrets that only the storm knew. Time became meaningless in that white void, measured only by the rhythm of their struggling steps and the growing numbness in Robert's extremities. Then Scout stopped, his body trembling with excitement rather than cold, and Robert heard it too. A faint cry carried on the wind like a prayer finally answered. The dog had led them to the old equipment shed, half buried in drifts, but still standing against the storm's assault, and from within came the sound of David's voice calling for help with the desperation of a child who had given up hope of being found. Robert's knees nearly buckled with relief as he realized that Scout had done the impossible, navigating through a blizzard that had blinded even the land itself to bring them to this moment of salvation. David emerged from the shed like a ghost, returning to life, his small body shaking with cold and fear that had aged him years in a single afternoon. His lips were blue as winter sky, and his eyes held the hollow look of someone who had stared into the face of death and found it staring back. Robert wrapped his son in his coat, feeling the boy's fragile heartbeat against his chest like a bird's wings beating against a cage of ribs. Scout pressed close to them both, his warm body creating a circle of comfort in the storm's merciless embrace. And Robert understood that this moment would divide his life into before and after, before he believed in miracles, and after he had witnessed one with his own eyes. The journey back to the house became a pilgrimage of faith, with Scout leading them through the white maze with the confidence of someone who had walked this path in dreams. The dog seemed to grow stronger with each step, his purpose burning bright as a beacon in the darkness of the storm. David clung to his father with desperate fingers, but his eyes never left Scout's moving form, watching the blind dog navigate the impossible with a wonder that cut through his fear like sunlight through clouds. The boy had always been drawn to broken things, but now he saw that Scout wasn't broken at all. He was simply different, gifted with senses that transcended the limitations of sight. The wind began to ease as they approached the house, as if the storm itself recognized that its work was done, that it had served its purpose in bringing them to this moment of understanding. Scout's tail wagged with quiet triumph as he led them to the front door, his mission completed with the dignity of a soldier returning from a successful campaign. Robert's hands shook as he fumbled with the door handle, not from cold, but from the overwhelming realization that he had been wrong about so many things, about pity, about worth, about the nature of gifts that come disguised as burdens. The warmth of the house embraced them like a mother's arms, and Scout settled by the fire with the satisfaction of someone who had finally found his true calling. David sat wrapped in blankets, sipping hot chocolate that steamed like incense in the firelight, but his attention remained fixed on Scout with an intensity that spoke of profound gratitude. The boy reached out tentatively to stroke the dog's fur, and Scout leaned into the touch with a contentment that seemed to radiate through the room, like warmth from the hearth. Robert watched this exchange with eyes that burned with unshed tears, understanding that his son was learning a lesson about love that no school could teach, that the greatest gifts often come from the most unexpected sources, wrapped in packages we might otherwise discard. The storm continued to rage outside, but within the house, a different kind of weather had settled, a climate of wonder and gratitude that transformed the very air they breathed. Scout's breathing had synchronized with David's, creating a rhythm of peace that seemed to heal wounds Robert hadn't even known existed. The dog's blindness, which had once seemed like a cruel joke of fate, now revealed itself as a different kind of vision. the ability to see with the heart, to navigate by love rather than sight, to find what was lost when others could only see obstacles. Robert found himself studying Scout's face, searching for signs of the wisdom that had saved his son, and finding instead only the simple contentment of a dog who had finally come home. As the night deepened and the storm's fury began to exhaust itself against the walls of their sanctuary, Robert made a silent promise to never again mistake pity for love or disability for inability. Scout had taught them that strength comes in forms they had never imagined, that guidance can come from those who seem most lost, and that sometimes the very thing we think we're saving ends up saving us instead. The dog's gentle snoring filled the room with a sound more precious than any symphony, and Robert knew that this night had changed them all in ways they were only beginning to understand. Spring arrived like a whispered promise, melting the last memories of that terrible blizzard into streams that sang of renewal and second chances. Scout moved through the ranch with the confidence of someone who had finally found his place in the world, his steps sure and purposeful as he navigated the familiar terrain that had become his kingdom. David followed him everywhere, the boy and the dog having formed a bond that transcended words, communicating through touches and shared silences that spoke louder than any conversation. Robert watched them from the porch, his coffee growing cold in his hands as he marveled at the transformation that had taken place in all their lives since that night when Scout had led them home through the storm. The dog had developed routines that amazed everyone who witnessed them, greeting the mailman with gentle dignity, knowing exactly when David's school bus would arrive, positioning himself by the gate each evening to welcome Robert home from his work in the fields. Scout's blindness had become irrelevant, overshadowed by senses so acute that he seemed to anticipate needs before they were even felt. The ranch hands spoke of him with reverence, telling stories of how he could predict weather changes hours before the sky showed any signs, how he could locate lost tools by scent alone, how he had become the ranch's unofficial guardian and guide. His presence had woven itself into the fabric of their daily lives so completely that Robert couldn't imagine how they had ever functioned without him. David had grown taller over the months, but more importantly, he had grown deeper. His understanding of the world expanded by his relationship with Scout in ways that formal education could never achieve. The boy spoke differently now, with a gentleness in his voice that came from learning to communicate with someone who relied on tone and touch rather than visual cues. He had become Scout's eyes in many ways, describing the world around them in vivid detail during their long walks, painting pictures with words that the dog seemed to see more clearly than if he had possessed sight. Their friendship had taught David that love wasn't about fixing what was broken, but about accepting what was different and finding the beauty in it. Robert found himself changed as well, his perspective on life shifted by the daily miracle of watching Scout navigate the world with such grace and purpose. The loneliness that had haunted him for years had been replaced by a sense of completeness that came not from having his needs met, but from meeting the needs of others. He had learned to see strength in vulnerability, wisdom in simplicity, and courage in the act of trusting despite past betrayals. Scout had shown him that healing wasn't about forgetting the past, but about allowing it to inform a better future, about transforming pain into purpose and isolation into connection. The evening ritual had become sacred to all three of them. David reading aloud by the fireplace while Scout lay with his head on the boy's lap, and Robert working on ranch accounts at the kitchen table, the sound of his son's voice creating a soundtrack of contentment that filled every corner of the house. Scout's breathing would deepen as the stories unfolded, his dreams perhaps filled with the adventures David described, his trust so complete that he could surrender to sleep, knowing he was safe and loved. These moments felt like prayers to Robert, expressions of gratitude for the unexpected grace that had entered their lives disguised as a discarded dog. As summer approached and the ranch burst into full bloom, Robert often found himself standing in the same spot where he had first seen Scout, remembering the pity that had motivated his purchase and marveling at how wrong he had been about who was saving whom. The dog had taught them that miracles don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they arrive quietly, on four legs and with clouded eyes, carrying gifts we don't recognize until we're desperate enough to accept help from the most unlikely sources. Scout had become more than a pet. He had become a teacher, a guide, and a living reminder that love sees what eyes cannot, and that the greatest rescues often happen when we think we're the ones doing the rescuing. Spring came to the Nevada ranch like a whispered promise, melting the last memories of that terrible blizzard into streams that sang through the valley. Robert watched from the porch as David ran across the meadow, the blind dog at his side, both of them chasing shadows that danced in the warm afternoon light. The boys' laughter carried on the wind, a sound that had returned gradually, like trust rebuilding itself one day at a time. The dog moved with confidence now, no longer the trembling creature Robert had bought out of pity, but a guardian whose blindness had become a different kind of sight. They had all learned to see with something deeper than eyes. The townspeople still talked about that night, how a blind dog had led a lost boy home through a storm that claimed 3 lives in the county. But Robert knew the real miracle wasn't in the rescue itself. It was in how brokenness had found brokenness and made something whole. The dog had taught them that love doesn't need perfect vision, only a perfect heart. David's nightmares had faded like winter snow, replaced by dreams where he ran endless fields with his 4-legged guardian. The boy understood now that heroes don't always come in the forms we expect, and that sometimes salvation wears a coat of matted fur and carries scars we cannot see. In the evenings, when the 3 of them sat on the porch watching the sun paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Robert felt something he'd forgotten existed: peace. The dog would rest his graying muzzle on David's lap, and the boy would stroke the animal's head with the gentle reverence of someone who knows he's touching grace. They had become a family forged not by blood alone, but by the understanding that we are all walking blind through storms, hoping someone will guide us home. The ranch no longer felt like a place of exile, but a sanctuary where broken things came to heal. Robert had learned that pity was just love that hadn't yet recognized itself, and that the creatures we rescue often end up rescuing us in return. The blind dog had shown them that sight is not about seeing the path ahead, but about trusting the heart that knows the way home. In the growing darkness of evening, as stars began to pierce the desert sky, Robert understood that some purchases are made with money, but the most valuable ones are paid for with open hearts. The dog had cost him $50 and given him back his son, his peace, and his faith in the invisible threads that connect all living things. Years would pass, and the story would be told and retold around kitchen tables and campfires. But for Robert, David, and their blind guardian, it was simply the beginning of a life where love had learned to see in the dark. The dog would live another 7 years, long enough to watch David grow into a young man who never forgot that courage sometimes comes on 4 legs, and that the greatest gifts often arrive disguised as burdens. When the old dog finally closed his sightless eyes for the last time, he was buried beneath the oak tree where he'd first learned to trust, his grave marked not with stone, but with the endless gratitude of 2 hearts he'd guided home through more storms than they could count.